Today's scripture reading is the gospel text for the first Sunday of Advent, the season of preparation for the coming of the Jesus at Christmas, which is why it might seem odd that the speaker this morning is Jesus himself, preaching in the temple in Jerusalem the last week of his life.
This particular passage is sometimes called the Little Apocalypse, a short vision of the end, or fulfillment of time. We tend to think of apocalypses as frightening, and often for good reason. But it's worth remembering that the word actually means revelation. So listen then for what this little apocalypse reveals about the coming of God into the world.
But about that day and hour no one knows, neither the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. For as the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away. So too will be the coming of the Son of Man.
Then two will be in the field, and one will be taken, and one will be left. Two women will be grinding meal together. One will be taken, and one will be left. Keep awake, therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But understand this: if the owner of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour.
Will you join your hearts with mine in prayer? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I love Advent. We have been listening to Christmas carols on the Light 93.9 for going on 3 weeks now. So I'm delighted that we are now officially able to begin decorating and preparing our hearts. It's December 1st, Advent 1, which means you get to open your Advent calendar today too, actually on the first Sunday of Advent. And kids, I have a bunch for you, so come find me after the service to make sure you get one. It is wonderful to be in this time of preparation. It is wonderful to prepare ourselves to celebrate, to serve together, to worship and to hear all these familiar stories and words and images. It is wonderful to be together. And yet our gospel lesson this morning is a little less than wonderful in some ways. The wonderful spiritual writer Kathleen Norris talks about how her grandmother loved images of Jesus like here as the thief in the night, if the owner of the house knew what time he was coming. But those images terrified Norris, and she gave thanks that her parents involved her in a church community where those frightening images were not the dominant discourse. I was talking to a colleague a few weeks ago who grew up in an evangelical congregation, and as we were talking about the gospel text, he was recalling, as he does fairly frequently, a song that was sung in his congregation back then called Left Behind. And it was basically about how some would go up and some would be taken away while they were working in the field or working in the kitchen. One would go and one would be left behind. And he was terrified as a child. terrified that he and the other believers would go, and his mother, the unbelievers, would be left behind. He was terrified of what was supposed to be, in some ways, a joyful thing to go to God, but he was terrified of that division. Terrified and traumatized by the sense that God had come to break apart what he had known and loved. What I appreciate about this passage, however, is that it does capture so much the danger and the risk of living in this world. And indeed, the danger and the risk of becoming a parent, of taking on biological motherhood. It's funny because I titled the sermon, What to Expect When You're Not Expecting, because the whole bit in the gospel lesson is about how we have to keep awake because we don't know. We don't know what to expect. We don't know what will come. We don't know when the hour will be. But we're so unused to that phrasing, right? The book title that we read when we are expecting is What to Expect When You Are Expecting. And so it was funny because on the front cover of the bulletin it says, What to Expect When You're Expecting. And that's what it said in the first slide. And now we have What to Expect When You're Not Expecting. And the confusion is right and good and fitting. One of the things, I bought a copy of What to Expect When You're Expecting when I was pregnant with my first daughter, Fiona. And I was very quickly frustrated with it. First, because it definitely anticipated that I was going to eat this particular diet that it laid out as being the best and most healthful for, the child growing in my womb. And it involved a lot of bran, and I was not going to eat a lot of bran in my pregnancy. Really, the only thing that I kept down for all 3 of my pregnancies were fast food breakfast sandwiches, milkshakes, thank you, and sour gummy candies, which I ate by the ton. Those were perhaps not best for their health, but they were best for me. And one of the things that we don't note very often about pregnancy is that the mother and the child are really one. What is good for one is pretty much good for the other. They are not at odds, even though when they're pummeling your insides, it feels like you are. There was one moment in that pregnancy, and we read so much. We were going to do it all right. We were going to be wonderful parents. We were going to follow the rules, and everything was going to go well. I still drank a lot of coffee, though I did cut down a little bit. A little. You could get half-calf mochas at Starbucks, so that's when I really became a Starbucks fan, for those half-calf mochas. You got the sensation of a fully drugged, beverage, but you could still stay within the limits of what was good for the child. But there was a day, fairly early on in the pregnancy, where I was enjoying a second cup of coffee at home in the morning, and my beloved spouse looked at me and he said, "Should you really be drinking that?" And he is still my beloved spouse today, despite his suggestion that I was not making a good decision for the child growing in my womb. We have so many hopes and fears in times of bringing new life into the world. We don't know what to expect, but we hope maybe by acting right, by doing the right thing, we can make everything okay. We can guarantee health and wellness and a bright future. I just finished a really fascinating book called Homeland Maternity, U.S. Security Culture and the New Reproductive Regime. I picked it up off the shelf. No, I was sent it to review. And But it's fascinating, and one of the way it's written by a woman who is a cultural studies professor at the University of Iowa, and she looks at a variety of cultural conversations around women and reproduction. She looks at teen pregnancy, and she looks at the morning after pill. She looks at freezing eggs so that you can delay pregnancy. She looks at, what's the other one? Anyway, she looks at all of these different things. But one of the things that she notes is the dominant thread all the way through is that our culture has privatized the risks of pregnancy and asked individual women to subsume and assume responsibility for all of them. If anything goes wrong when you are expecting, it is because you have done something wrong. And we see this not just in the ways that, we frown upon our friends who may have had a glass of wine and then something happens in their pregnancy, but we see it legislatively too, as we see increasingly punitive responses in a wide variety of states to women who experience miscarriage or other problems. She tells the story of a woman who was in recovery from drug addiction when she found that she was pregnant, but when she sought prenatal care, disclosed to the hospital social worker that she had a history of addiction, and she was put under forced, she was hospitalized against her will then in a psychiatric unit for a long time, and was unable to sort of seek her freedom because she had disclosed that she had this history of addiction, and somehow that had put the law, the social worker thought, said that she had put her child at risk. She highlights in ways, my marginalia in this book is just ugh, like all the way through. As she looks not just, again, at cultural and, film stories and the fictions and narratives that we tell each other, but of actual historical incidents in which we treat expecting mothers very poorly. But not just mothers, all women. Her whole chapter on egg freezing talks about the rise in this cultural conversation and the way that we talked about fertility as Americans and infertility issues as, an increasing result of women trying to have it all and waiting over time, and wanting to work forever and then start their family. And it was very much the women's responsibility to take on the risks of waiting, to make preparation, to make sure that they could do all of that. One of the things that she notes that was so fascinating, because I recall those conversations, she talks about how they kind of peak in the years right after 9/11. And those were those years when I was in graduate school and first starting my family. And I remember that challenge, that conversation. But one of the fascinating things that she notes is that our levels of infertility in our population are pretty steady over time. There are things that affect it. There are environmental factors. There are our availability and our ability to access health care. There are indeed costs associated with having children. But none of those things are based on the private decision whether or not to work for a while or to build a life first before welcoming a child. And yet, despite that fact, our narrative is that this is a woman's responsibility. That if we make good choices, if we do the right thing, somehow all will be well. There is danger associated with motherhood, with parenting, with something new coming into the world. There is indeed risk. And one of the hardest things for us is that we can't control what will happen, what will be. I rejoiced this week because another colleague, a woman who I knew through a network of clergy women I don't know well. I feel like most of our relationship or friendship has been over Facebook, so it's super deep. But she had experienced a variety of pregnancy losses over the years, and just a couple weeks ago posted a shot of herself at 36 weeks pregnant. And then we didn't hear a whole lot, and I was so anxious. She had lost a number of pregnancies. She, in the past, through in vitro, through intrauterine insemination, through everything, she had had so much loss. And then on Wednesday, I think, she posted a picture of her son, Zeke. She's a pastor, Ezekiel, right? These poor pastor's kids. And he's gorgeous. And we all celebrated with her. But we were nervous. I was nervous when we didn't hear anything. So many things can go wrong. So many things can go wrong. We heard these words from Mary just now, sung beautifully by the worship ensemble. We heard these words, which are both so personal. You hear in Mary's Magnificat, "My soul magnifies the Lord, for the Lord has done great things to me." And there is that sense that is so real when one becomes a parent or when one falls in love, or so many things, that you are the only one who has ever felt this way. Has anyone else ever felt this way? And yet, in the midst of that personal connection, there's also the universal there. The Lord has done these things in the world. Even in our gospel lesson today, we hear about individuals sent, individuals gathered, and yet the sense is that the ramifications are universal. Part of our Advent journey then begins in adopting new perspectives, perspectives that are not our own. How do others hear these stories? How do others hear the promise of being taken away or left behind? How do others hear the stories of taking on risk, of not knowing what to expect, of the call to be ready? When I heard my friend Adam talking about that song, Left Behind, and how it terrorized him as a child, we were talking about the new movie about Mr. Rogers, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, which pastors love, right? Mr. Rogers, he was a pastor on TV, but not like the bad kind of pastor on TV. So everybody's a fan. And there's this new movie, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, about him. And so we were talking about the gospel lesson in the context of Mr. Rogers. And Adam wondered if there was something there, if we should lean into the fear and the uncertainty of this text to know that our fears are real. Our fears are real. There is danger here. And perhaps we should just feel our feelings. That's something Mr. Rogers was definitely about. We should feel our feelings. We should not hide from them, even if they are hard. And I thought about that, but listening to him, it called to mind the words of one of my daughter's therapists, my daughter has some anxiety, and I, always wanting to be empathetic, to step into her fears, to say, yes, I am here with you. Yes, your fear is real. Yes, I want to help you name your experience. And the beloved Dr. Ann says, no, stop that. And I'm like, thank you, Dr. Ann. What should I do instead? And she said, Your child needs to know that yes, you are with her, and yes, her feelings are real, but that you are the parent. She should not have to shoulder her fear. She should not have to shoulder the risks. She should not have to shoulder those anxieties herself. Tell her it's okay. You will take care of it. I bristle a lot at the idea that we are supposed to submit to God's will, that we are supposed to turn things over, to let go and let God. And yet there is something powerful in the idea here in the gospel that we cannot know. We cannot know, and yet we have to trust that it is good, that what is coming is of God. It is good. It is unknown. It is frightening. It may upend everything, but it is good. I've seen more movies in the last couple weeks than I have in forever, and so I, like many other parents this week, saw Frozen 2, and it is great. I cried through the whole thing, but I cry at movies. And the big song, there's a number of big songs. There's like an 80s power ballad in the middle of the woods, which is fantastic. But the other big song, the Let It Go sequel, is called Into the Unknown. Elsa, you'll recall Elsa with the magic ice powers, has settled in to her reign as Queen of Arendelle. But she has begun, and there's this lovely vision too. They're playing games one night, the whole household, and it's Olaf the snowman and Sven the reindeer and Kristoff, the love interest of her sister Anna and Elsa, and they're all having family game night. And that, right there, is this wonderful flipping of what we think of as traditional nuclear Disney families, right? Like, there's interspecies fun, there's a magic snowman, there's an unmarried couple, everybody's together. And so it's in the midst of this that Elsa hears a voice calling, and no one else can hear it. She calls it a siren, calling her, and she's afraid, right? The sirens, you remember from mythology, were these sweet-sounding voices on the cliffs, and they called to the sailors until they ran their boats into the cliffs and died, right? A siren is like a dangerous thing. So she's nervous about this voice. And yet, it keeps calling. It keeps calling, and finally she has to follow. She sings this great song, Into the Unknown. She's going to go into the unknown. And when she goes, no spoilers, it's still early, but she discovers danger. She discovers unexpected things. She uncovers a narrative she never thought she would hear. She finds truth, and all gathered together find a reconciliation that they didn't even know they needed. There is still danger and risk. People with power have to let go of some of it. People with privilege have to be willing to stake it for reconciliation. They're not really ready. They're not really keen to go. But they go, trusting that what it is will be good. In this Advent season, then, keep awake, be ready. Know that the danger and the risk is not yours to shoulder alone. The dangers and the risks of the world are not your fault. But we are called to respond, to go into the unknown, trusting that as we go, we will find our God. Amen.